In this episode of How to Build a Better Band, we're going to take a look at current trends among players and instrumentation. And what do I mean when I say trends? Well, we want to look at what instruments are being used and in what numbers. And are any auxiliary instruments becoming more popular? And to do this, let's just go down straight score order in the band. And we'll start at the very top and look at the flutes. In the early days of the wind band, flutes were an add-on. They weren't seen as really an essential part of the wind band. We can find a lot of very early wind band music without flutes. Or if there are flute, it is just piccolo. Today, the number of flute players has grown to large numbers. So where older music might have a single flute part or flute and a piccolo, we move then toward two flute parts and two flutes and a piccolo. Well, sometimes our numbers of flutes are 8 players, if not more. It is theoretically now possible to split flute parts into more than just one piccolo, 2 flutes, which is considered standard. Calling for 4 flutes, not a big deal. It's not going to challenge most ensembles. Oh, we got 4 flutes and 5 flutes, meh. Now, let's take a look though at the auxiliary instruments. In the early 20th century, there was a big push being made to include the E-flat flute, sometimes called the soprano flute or the terz flute, because it's a third higher than the C flute. And this instrument was used for a time in some bands. However, it really never solidified its place, and it's by and large fallen by the wayside. Personally, I would love to see some instrument, whether it's the E-flat flute or the G treble flute, that is something between the piccolo and the C flute in use more often, because there's just a need for a little bit lighter tone quality up there. On the larger end though, alto flutes are becoming quite a bit more popular, as are tenor flutes, sometimes called a bass flute. In fact, most of the time called a bass flute because I'm the only one that calls them tenors. But these instruments are becoming more and more widely available, particularly through the use of flute choirs. And in fact, these flute choirs are using bigger flutes still. The so-called contrabass flute, which is really just a bass flute in the same range as the bassoon. These instruments are starting to grow in popularity, and if we extrapolate the trend there, it could be possible that these instruments become more of a standard feature in modern wind band writing. This is one of those areas where we have a lot of growth happening very quickly, and band composers could do well to follow these trends. Next, let's move on to the double reeds. And we're going to just take the oboes and the bassoons as a complete unit. There isn't a lot we can say here. What we can say is, yes, there are more and more players playing on oboe and bassoon, but we can't really put a lot of trends into this because still it is difficult for a lot of non-professional bands to find competent oboe and bassoon parts. And part of this, I think, has to do with the music. Your oboe and bassoon players tend to be your most concerned with the music itself, with performance. And with bands like community bands or non-professional groups, the music that tends to get performed is pops, arrangements, orchestral stuff, and your oboe and bassoon players are just like, I'm going to pass on that. I can go and play in an orchestra, and I get to play the same music except it was actually written for me. So they're going to pass, which is why trying to extrapolate a trend in modern wind band music for your double reeds is a little bit more difficult. What we can say is the contrabassoon is becoming more commonly seen. Even 20 years ago, back to right at the time I started undergrad, contrabassoons were not commonly seen in some colleges. My undergrad didn't have one. But now, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area at least, there are major high schools that have contrabassoons. So we've got an instrument that is starting to grow a lot more in popularity. The auxiliary instruments beside contrabassoon and English horn really are still off limits for all but the wackiest and most experimental of composers. Stuff like oboe d'amore, bass oboe, tenorone, sub-contrabassoon. So we can't really extrapolate anything here other than contrabassoon is becoming more popular, but finding good double reed players is still difficult. Let's look at clarinets. The trend over the last 20, 30 years for clarinets is a reduction, oddly, in the numbers of auxiliary instruments seen. Alto clarinet is starting to go away. In fact, it's pretty much gone away. E-flat clarinet, well, a lot of people aren't using it. The E-flat contra alto clarinet, the great bass clarinet, is starting to go away. And bands just want the B-flat clarinet, the B-flat bass clarinet, the B-flat contrabass clarinet. And we're seeing this reduction. So some band composers are responding in kind that they only have B-flat, B-flat, B-flat. This trend really should be reversed, and we really should see a change in the attitude toward particularly the E-flat instruments. Something that we could theoretically extrapolate into the future for our trend is a growing use of C clarinets. Those tend to be becoming more popular with high quality instruments available and available at a reasonable price. G clarinets are actually starting, just the very beginning of starting to become, people are getting to be curious about them. But on the whole, clarinet diversity is shrunk to really its smallest size ever. And that trend probably will reverse, I would think, probably in the next 10 years. And we'll start seeing more composers trying to do things with that, but that's hard to tell. Saxophone, however, I tend to see a lot of growth with. Like the flutes, that we've had this expansion over the years. Flute choirs are really popular, so are saxophone choirs, and saxophone players are looking to expand. Oddly, the saxophone section has really only ever been limited to traditionally about 4 players in the wind band, and it's 4 parts, 4 players. Although you'll see some with 5 and occasionally some with 6. But a lot of school bands, a lot of community bands are going to have a lot more saxophone players than 4 or 5 or 6. 8, 10, 12 saxophone players, not unheard of. This would be an area where some expansion could be seen. 4 alto saxophone parts. It sounds theoretically crazy, but guess what? Finding 4 alto sax players, not a biggie. Why not just go all the way to 8? 4 altos, 2 tenors, 2 baries. Maybe take one of those altos and put them on soprano. Maybe take a bari, put it on bass, because bass saxes are starting to become popular again. And we could see that if we continue to extrapolate that into the future, why not just have a section of saxophones equal to the section of clarinets, just for theoretical purposes? A big section of clarinets, a big section of saxophones. We could get some really interesting textures and timbres there. We could actually really start to replicate the sound of the string section. Why not? Let's look at our brass. Horns. 4 horns is pretty standard. I could see in large professional bands expanding this to 6 or 8 horns. It's very rarely been done. I only know of a couple of band pieces that use any more than 4 horns, but why not? And why not, if we're going to have those extra horns, have them double on Wagner tuba? because there are Wagner tubas now becoming more available, particularly those instruments coming out of the Jinbao factory. Trumpets, cornets, let's look at those. The cornet in American bands is pretty much extinct. Even significant works that call for cornet don't really use it anymore. Trumpets are just taking over everything. Outside of the US, particularly in bands that are influenced by the British tradition, cornets are very much still there. England, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, the cornet is still very, very popular, very common. But in the US, the cornet's gone. And if I were to extrapolate it, I would say it's probably not coming back unless there's a real push for historical accuracy, which is a shame because it is a distinct and lovely timbre that needs to come back. Trumpets, on the other hand, what we could see is a more gradual move from the B-flat trumpet to the C trumpet, particularly for professional groups. We can also see the piccolo trumpet really starting to become a much more independent and integral part to that section. We might also see some of the other auxiliary trumpets, like the E-flat or D trumpet. Maybe bass trumpet coming into play a little bit. Though, remember, that's never going to be played by a trumpet player. It's always going to be played by a trombone or euphoniumist. And let's go on to trombones. What we can see is, typically we have 2 tenor and a bass trombone part, sometimes 3 tenor and a bass trombone part. But a lot of times we do have more players than this. So expanding this is probably not out of the question. Alto trombones are making a comeback, and growing in popularity very quickly are contrabass trombones, which are not featured in a lot of wind band music. So we could easily see the contrabass trombone becoming adopted very quickly into the professional level wind band. Euphoniums and tubas, there's not a lot of trends here, particularly because there's not a lot of instrument development here. 2 euphoniums, 2 tubas is still going to be pretty standard, although a lot of times we do see a lot more than 2 tubas, particularly in large bands. So we could see, from the composer's point of view, writing more than 2 tuba parts, writing for bass tuba and contrabass tuba separately. There is starting to be a push in the American tradition to start doing focusing a lot more on bass tuba usage, the E-flat or the F tuba, as opposed to the giant C or B-flat tubas. But there's not a lot of trends there. There is some trend to bring back the B-flat baritone horn, which had been abandoned in American tradition for a long time. But the baritone horn is really only going to be brought in for accurate performances of things like whole suite in E-flat or Lincolnshire posing. Percussion, more marimbas, more tuned percussion. This is really kind of where a lot of players are going, is they're spending so much time on marimbas, vibraphones, crotales. Stuff like this is really starting to take up a bulk of the percussionist time. 5-octave marimbas are pretty ubiquitous now, whereas 20 years ago they were unheard of. 30 years ago they were completely non-existent. So larger marimbas, larger vibraphones too. 4-octave vibraphones are now becoming a thing, whereas the 3-octave had been standard for many, many decades. Auxiliaries bringing into the band, we're starting to see some use of cellos coming back into the band. Double basses are really still holding their own. One of the trends I do see is, instead of using 1 double bass, is using 2 double basses. So that is actually a trend I quite like. Using the 2nd double bass, it just adds a little bit extra. And then, of course, we have our auxiliaries, piano, celeste. Something I'm seeing more and more is use of harpsichord. Pipe organ, of course, has always been there. Some use of harmonium, but that instrument is really difficult to get a hold of a good working one, so you don't see that as often. But by and large, those are the trends I see. So there's expansion in some areas, like flutes and saxophones in particular, contraction in some areas, like clarinets, and then expanded ranges in percussion. So those are our trends that we're currently seeing in the modern wind band. Now, let me know down in the comments what trends you've seen. How are things changing? Are you seeing the same trends that I'm seeing? Are you seeing more and more saxophones and fewer clarinets? Or are you seeing more flutes? So, as always, comment down in the section down below, and like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, let's continue to build a better band.